Hello there, I'm someone else here, and I want to talk about something that's been bothering me for some time and is fast becoming, and will certainly become, just about the number one domestic issue facing all of us: paying for care. Given the massive public financial costs required to restore, let alone and expand and develop in the way we all want, not only our crisis-stricken healthcare, ambulance and social care, young old disabled services, but our more general austerity-beleaguered and overstretched education, primary, secondary and tertiary and training public services, our overstretched social housing shelter public services, our overstretched basic security, police, fire, prisons, provisions, border public services, our overstretched local environment, pavements, roads, rubbish collection public services, our overstretched recreational, libraries, parks, playing fields, swimming pools, youth facilities public services, our overstretched artistic, museums and galleries public services, and our overstretched communications, the good old BBC, public services, etc., etc. All essential care services, in their widest sense, all absolutely necessary and all extremely expensive to restore. How are we ever going to meet the ever-rising, potentially massive public care bill without, if not most would argue, jeopardising the old productive tax-paying economy? Particularly at a time of already unprecedentedly high public debt, which we sometime going to have to pay off, and rapid rising cost inflation, which puts some limits on anything we can do. And if we can't, or won't, under the present system, actually meet the full coming public care bill, which seems very, very likely, whatever anyone might now say, what happens to us and our children and our children's children and more distant future generations in all our coming hours of unmet, or barely met, rising national needs? Utterly against the grain, we here think that despite all the difficulties and completely contrary to the prevailing wisdom, provided some simple reforms which I will outline, we can actually meet the old-coming public care bill, whatever it is, whatever it may turn out to be, in full, fairly easily, with essentially positive and virtually nil negative economic effects, and should therefore do so. And we want to persuade you that we can and should meet the full public bill, so you can join us in striving to get the essential public care that we all so desperately need and want now and in the future, for without a concerted effort on all our parts in the right direction, which, as I say, I will spell out, our already beleaguered public care services are likely to either become completely screwed into the ground and/or totally privatised, both of which would be an unmitigated disaster for the great mass of us, particularly the poor and needy. The whole current debate on paying for care is bedevilled by a giant popular misunderstanding of how the public economy actually works, if not how the general economy actually works. 4. Simple, basic, positive, irrefutable economic points, all very much statements of the bleeding obvious. First, economically, in one way or another, we all have to pay by market price or by public tax for everything we get. Someone has to initiate an enterprise, stump up the money, put in the effort, do the work, and we have to pay for this. People normally don't do it for free. there's usually got to be some return on their effort. Creating output jobs and incomes, meeting costs, where necessary making profits, where relevant rewarding shareholders, paying off debt, and hopefully providing a surplus for the future, all require generating sufficient revenue from the paying public. Whatever else we might do, first off we have to set a price or tax that people are hopefully prepared to pay for the goods and services we intend to produce. Second, the main economic and social return we as a society get, the value we get for our bucks, is the thing produced, products made, the service given, problem solved, opportunity seized. Yes, we have to pay the money costs, but against this, privately or publicly, we get the benefit of the good or service we otherwise would not have and obviously prefer to have at the price. Care, in its widest sense, education, health, social care, basic security, etc., is clearly as much a part of this real potential economic and social return for which we pay as anything else for which we pay. Third, even monetarily as a whole, economy-wide, we don't virtually ever lose out by producing something, private or public, and paying for it. For everything we pay out to finance the new goods or services, private or public, becomes someone else's new income which didn't previously exist. As new output is created, overall incomes rise at least proportionately to pay for it. In simple economic terms, money circulates. So to get the new goods and services overall, we don't have to cut our spending on other things. Some of us might, others, particularly those with the new jobs and incomes, will gain. Overall, we're okay. Overall, it's not a zero-sum game, where if something rises, something else must fall. Monetarily, economy-wide, any net new production, private or public, however costly, should overall be at least economically self-sustaining, self-financing. All real production, private or public, essentially pays for itself. A fact which might usefully be enshrined here as the first law of positive economics. Fourth, the fact is that privately or publicly, initially, we rarely pay the full price for the new goods and services we get out of our immediately disposable incomes. Nearly everybody has savings accrued from past incomes only one way or another, lending or borrowing as investors or consumers. At least initially, we partly pay either out of these savings or by temporarily going into debt, knowing that as in the past, over time our overall incomes will catch up so we can pay it off. And as we therefore as a society get more in the way of net new money incomes from the new production, any new production, than we initially pay out of our disposable incomes in prices and taxes for it, our current overall net real disposable incomes rise, and we have money left to shell out on yet more goods to meet yet new consumer needs and demands. As a result, any net new production, private or public, not only proportionately increases our national output, jobs, incomes, revenue and wealth, the latter tends to spiral progressively upwards more than proportionately to embrace ever more sectors, ever higher overall growth, which might also be enshrined here as the second law of positive economics. Eventually, as over time debt is paid off and savings restored, an increasing proportion of the cost necessarily does get financed by price or tax out of our net disposable incomes. Net money outflows and inflows equalise, net real income stabilise, and the positive income multiplier, which is what we have been talking about, the positive income multiplier, comes to an end. but at a higher, sometimes much higher general level of economic output, jobs, incomes, revenue and consumption. And this process is not simply one-off. It is hopefully going on all the time. Every day, privately or publicly, hopefully someone is making the decision to invest and work to produce something they think people will want. And overall growth, jobs, incomes, revenue and prosperity continue to spiral upwards, even if somewhat more modestly than we would sometimes hope. This good news story is that at the best of times, privately or publicly, the economy works. We put in the work and effort and get more services and more goods as a result. Supply rises to meet demand. Economic equilibrium is attained. Satisfaction, as the economists say, is maximised. What else would we expect for our efforts and sweat? No effects, no return, no gain. That is why no one is putting the screws, at least on the private sector, to live within its means, even for things that are marginal, if not negative importance, like junk food, sugary drinks, betting, sex work, pornography, etc., etc. No one asks how we as a nation can possibly afford them. No one asked how we could possibly afford to put a fairly regularly replaceable personal computer on our laptop in every home, and an even more regular replaceable iPhone in every hand, or whether this would be inflationary or a burden on anyone having to pay the not insignificant price, or whether we would be economically better off without it, though clearly involving a massive ongoing financial extraction from the general public. No, it was rather presented, if it was presented at all, despite increasingly being produced overseas, by the way, as an unmitigated success story, an economic plus, which it clearly is. It clearly is. Some goods and services may have dubious social effects, but financially, they all tend to do much more than employ people and pay their own way. At least monetarily, they all tend to contribute economically more than they take out. Ergo, historically continuous national economic growth. How else explain it? In all cases, we pay the bill, private or public. The $1,000 question here facing us from the outset, simply by producing and or distributing whatever it is we produce or distribute, and creating new jobs and incomes and revenue by so doing. But if the economy works so positively, why doesn't it? For crucial public care, basic security, local environment services, why the chronic shortage of the very things we almost need and want? Why is supply here always so chronically short of demand? If ultimately public output is as self-financing, self-sustaining as the rest of the productive economy, which it certainly is, whatever anyone, anywhere, at any time might say, it certainly is, what's stopping it? What's stopping us providing it? Well, first, since care provides for public need, it can't be delivered solely by market price, since the neediest, who are often the poorest, will be last in the queue, if they're in the queue at all, rather than first as they should be. It can only be humanly financed through a public impost tax on all of us. And while we're reasonably happy to pay over the counter for our private consumer goods, which we generally get as we spend, no one likes paying tax, especially for things that might not immediately benefit us, like other people's education or care or benefits or pensions, or for government spending on prestige projects or armaments, or jobs and incomes for themselves, or through contracts for their bodies, etc., etc. Second, those with the power, the elite who own and run things here, particularly don't like paying tax, and have persuaded themselves that through their superior intelligence and wit, they, virtually alone as decision makers, produce the goods and services and create the incomes and wealth that the rest of us enjoy, and that tax on them can only be counterproductive, killing the goose that is laying all our golden eggs. The fact that so many of them so unashamedly pay themselves hundreds, if not thousands of times their ordinary, hard-working workers get, testifies to the sheer strength and universality of this ludicrously distorted belief. They wouldn't, of course, apply this logic, keep revenue from the general public to an absolute minimum so as not to burden the economy generally, to their own prices and income and revenue. No, they clearly see, as we have argued, their own initial decision specifically to extract revenue from the public by setting prices as the only way to create the new national growth and wealth they so compliment themselves on achieving, not setting their own proper prices in order to obtain the finance necessary to produce new goods and services in the first place. They would rightly see us simply stopping the whole economic train in its tracks. Not exactly consistent with their negative attitude to public production, therefore, but what's a little inconsistency in pursuit of a good cause. Third, having in their minds established the fact that they alone create virtually all the country's economic wealth, it's but a small step for them and many, if not most, others who should know better, to divide the economic world falsely, into two distinct nations. The productive private one of the free enterprisers, though they themselves, of course, active, efficient, competitive and creative, above all real and definable as business, indeed as the economy, and the non-productive public one of officials and bureaucrats, passive, subordinate, unimaginative, and ultimately financially dependent on the former for all it does, something rather less than real, certainly not business, and not necessarily part of the economy. In effect, conflating active, often harder, often more creative, more enterprising, paid public service work with general welfare payouts, specifically for people not working and earning, or at least not working and earning enough. Fourth, politicians, most of whom are part of this power elite, are particularly prone to this keep taxes low to promote private, only private, growth thinking. One UK political party even takes the minimise tax to maximise private growth mantra as its first, if not its only article of faith. Even if this means severe continuing cuts in essential public services, continuing austerity, the consequences of which are now so clearly upon us and upon our children. But even more progressive politicians tend to go along with the general logic, at least to the extent of being in two minds about whether they really want to raise taxes to pay even for the progressive things they espouse, but risk jeopardising private growth, as they too often see it. Starmer's just made this very point almost in these very terms, as well as worrying about alienating the general tax-paying electorate. And unfortunately, the rest of the opinion-forming elite, the advisors and consultants, the media, academia, even economists, for God's sake, all supposedly earning their money by dispassionately promoting the truth, go along with this current divisive logic pretty unquestioningly, since it's what everyone believes anyway, or just about everyone. And it just sort of accord in their minds with a general view that the UK must give absolute priority above anything else to developing a properly advanced industrial and manufacturing sector to provide internationally competitive advanced manufacturing products, to rebuild our decayed infrastructure, and to supply new environmental friendly green output, for example. But this does not mean that we don't equally need to develop a properly advanced care sector independently alongside it on its own merits. Both sectors independently extracting revenue from the general public to grow more output and jobs for essential economic and social purposes in the self-sustaining, symbiotic, more money in than out, every bit else basis we so painfully earlier outlined. Fifth, and most significant, the system for determining what is publicly spent and how it is paid for is, as far as public services are concerned, itself fundamentally flawed. For however crucial, running public services is but one of a whole raft of things the government has to do. It has to manage the general economy through monetary and fiscal policy. It has to service the national debt. It has to stimulate and incentivise the private sector to enable it to grasp opportunities for growth and development, including, some time ago, using this reasoning to massively bail out the financial sector. It has to finance public infrastructure more generally. It has to make proper provision for defence of the realm, and now for the defence of Europe more generally. It has to pay for our administrators, governors and rulers, for itself in fact. It has to provide for state pensions. And it should at least try to attain a fair distribution of net incomes through tax benefit money transfer policies, hopefully from rich to poor. All these are important objectives and all compete directly for limited tax revenue, and financing all of them inevitably therefore represents a major tax call on people's financial resources, viewed negatively by the general public and difficult to apportion to any single element, however positively or negatively regarded of itself. And it's easy to see how public services don't and can't and never will come out of the central government budgetary complex all that well. All this is despite the fact that people in the public sector work and earn and put in effort and pay their taxes like everyone else and produce goods and services that count fully as GDP. They do count fully as GDP and are generally valued more than anything anyone else produces. Plus the fact that as public austerity in effect invites the financially less encumbered private sector to step in and fill the rising needs gap, a large and increasing part of the private sector is now actually engaged on producing for profit exactly the same goods and services, education, health, social care, housing, etc., that are only economically devalued when produced publicly, especially in places like the USA, where providing privatised healthcare and associated medical supplies and equipment is recognised as one of, if not the, long-term major element in the country's ongoing wealth creation, a major generator of its overall economic production. It's despite the fact that investment in education, training and health and local infrastructure, increasing the quality skills of labour, is increasingly recognised as the most needed investment in the 21st century. It's despite the fact that healthcare supply and equipment manufacture offer probably the greatest potential in advanced prosthetics, developmental biochemistry, computer-directed diagnostics and surgery, general engineering and neuroscience for future technological development. It's despite the fact that refocusing the economy towards the production of our most needed interpersonal care services would alone alter the balance favouring the consumption of off-polluting, increasingly costly, energy-intensive, material consumer investment goods, both often from abroad. And it is despite the fact that new locally focused interpersonal public care security service production would not only be less polluting and inflationary and less easy to be replaced by imports or technologised away, properly developed public interpersonal care security jobs could become the much needed, highly valued, personally fulfilling, professional and semi-professional occupations which could hopefully significantly replace the present slew of extremely unsocial, insecure, temporary, exploitative, ultramenial, gig economy jobs that today's young people are too often forced into. If many more properly valued professional public jobs were made available, employers would not be as easily able to get along with free internships, 0 hours, 0 non-wage benefit contracts and other current abominations. As for the inhibitions of bureaucracy, the UK private sector can barely be lauded for its efficiency and flexibility and bottom-up, cooperatively involved organisation, which is presumably what the polar opposite of bureaucracy actually is, especially in international comparative terms, and often puts greater stress in making money through purely extracting value than actually producing goods. And anyway, as more and more obviously material demands are met, even at great expense in marketing and advertising and cosmetic enhancements, plus deliberately built-in obsolescence, the wastes of deliberately built-in obsolescence. The private sector is often hard placed to produce beyond the level of bare minimum replacement demand, let alone come up with really new useful things rather than more costly, hyped up versions of the same things. Without the still desperately in demand care security sector in its widest sense, arguably the only UK sector that is still in great demand, what chance for long-term UK growth, incomes and jobs? What chance for the climate? What chance for the planet? The only way out of this mess, in which we're allowed to spend just about whatever we want on associated consumer peripherals, recirculated gadgets and gizmos, dubious personal services, and of course newly privatised health, education and dentistry, etc. services, but which leave the vast mass of us with inadequate support in our very hours of need, and the rich either untouched by its effect or reaping the benefits of what is increasingly offered to them as privatised profit-making opportunities, is fundamental radical reform. This means taking basic public services out of the central government budgetary complex where they don't and can and never will fare very well, and while obviously keeping them in the public sector, placing them as fully as possible in the more autonomous public enterprise sphere, where they should arguably always have been, for whatever else they are or they are not. Unlike social transfer expenditure on pensions and benefits, they are undubitably, personally, highly creative, skilled, productive enterprises in any meaning of the term, and should be recognised as such. For this purpose, we could simply adopt the model of the nationalised industries of old for each of the basic public services, and return to the system of quasi-independent governing boards which ran them on a revenue pricing, although in our case revenue taxing, basis. But instead of being largely one-man band organisations of ex-private business executives, ex-top civil servants and other members of the elite, the Beechings and McGregors of this world, if you remember, who wouldn't necessarily have public care priorities over much in mind, putting a whole range of more equal people on the boards who would care. Representatives of those actually producing the goods and services, employee and management groups, those using them, client groups, those voluntarily supporting them, friends groups, those with local interests in them, local interest groups, would you believe, those independent experts pronouncing creatively on them, academic groups, those concerned about their general social effects, social and environmental groups, and those concerned about having to pay for them, taxpayer groups. Viz, putting the general public back into public services. Plus, of course, some direct government appointees to ensure, if needed, that the broader national interests are taken fully into account. The first responsibilities of these new wide-ranging representative boards would obviously be to elect from themselves a chairperson who could coordinate the board's proceedings and ensure that everyone gets a say, and to choose, hopefully largely from within the services themselves, subsidiary executive bodies, which may of course largely already exist, responsible for overall management, long-term and day-to-day, including arrangements for service output, throughput and quality, subject to the governing influence of the representative boards. One key public service principle that would obviously have to be retained is that they continue to be provided according to need on a free at the point of use basis. Obviously, also therefore, we would have to retain central government's role in setting central tax rates, including for care, hopefully on a more progressive basis than now. But the particular public services should each be essentially free to determine how much we should all pay on these given rates on a pence in the pound basis for what we absolutely want. Cumulatively, this would add up to a significantly higher cost than now, but determined specifically by what we are prepared to pay in each sector for what we absolutely want to have, viz. a fair price for crucial services rendered compared to the prices we have to pay for all other services rendered. They were composed of different people with different interests. Virtually everyone on the representative governing boards would not only be strongly committed to the purposes their service meets and concerned about wider social and environmental issues, but would also be taxpayers, as well as clients or potential clients, concerned therefore to strike an appropriate balance between what we all want and what we are all prepared to pay. So they would be at least as likely to act judiciously, if somewhat more humanly, with their own money, as those in charge under the current system. According to general economic reasoning, which we have been at pains to outline, increased care spending thus facilitated like any other productive spending, which it is, whatever anyone may say or has said it is, can only have good positive economic multiplier effects all around, as we have previously explained. And hopefully, as this becomes obvious, real progress can be made towards meeting still outstanding national need. Taking public services out of the inevitably central budgetary complex in this way would not only allow them to charge whatever is necessary to meet need, it would still leave the government with enough remaining tax to enable it to adequately fulfil its wider fiscal remit, including paying pensions and other social benefits. Indeed, as now recognised positively productive enterprises, any real public expansion can only have overall expansionary effects not only on output, jobs and incomes, but on overall tax revenue, increasing the overall amount available to meet other outstanding public needs. Relieving the government from immersion in detailed day-to-day public service operation would also allow it to better focus on those central public service functions only it can play, undertaking major investments, viz. To obtain a fairer geographical north-south balance, using its central legal powers to exercise general regulatory public oversight and ensure, for example, safe medical procedures and medication, and continually review and, where necessary, tweak the developing situation within each service. A new system, but one arguably of much better balance. The reformed care, education, local environment, basic security services should not be run on the existing highly top-down basis, however. The emphasis should be very much on establishing frontline local entities comprised of the various local groups concerned, especially local management and staff teams, alone in a position to identify interpersonal care problems as they emerge and needs as they arise at the sharp end, and effectively act to meet local problems directly or push issues through the established managerial channels where necessary to the very top bodies where decisions on central finance are made. Ideally, these internal teams would manage the service locally in full conjunction with users, local authorities, local charities and interest groups, the churches, taxpayers' representatives, and everyone willing and able to make a contribution, bearing in mind that ordinary people on the ground, particularly parents and neighbours, have the primary responsibility for the education and health of their own children, and are hopefully in the best position to work with the authorities to reduce such activities as drug taking, vandalism and crime. Local authorities would retain or re-attain a major responsibility for many care, education, local environment, housing, etc. services. Centralised public boards for the relevant services would not only help coordinate and complement these local efforts, but in some cases replace central government in determining the allocation of much needed, centrally tax-financed local funds, supplemented as far as possible by local government rates to encourage local democracy. The ideal should be to devolve as much managerial power as possible to local frontline public service staff to enhance, professionalise and managerialise their role as much as possible, so as to empower them to deal with the largely interpersonal care type problems and potentialities that only they can deal with directly, speedily and effectively. Adopting a fully cooperative principle would not only require maximum practical staff involvement in decision making directly and through a proper representative structure accountable to each specific group, as we have described, it would involve staff and management centrally meeting to review and determine existing manpower, job grading, promotional structures, with the aim of bringing about a more rational and fairer top-to-bottom service-wide structure of jobs and spread of incomes from the very highest public executive to the most menial public worker, and secure for each public employee, however initially educated, the maximum opportunity for development and advancement throughout the whole hierarchical structure, through continuous employee education and training, itself a fully economically productive job and wealth creating activity. This would not only give positive meaning to the education for life concept, but reduce the existing intense, punishing psychological health pressures on our school children and their families to get the winning school exam grades at an early age as their only current means of possibly obtaining good professional jobs. Granted, this whole new proposal is at one level extremely financially radical, but there's no need for anyone to panic. It doesn't have to be introduced overnight on a wholesale blanket, whole public sector basis, or even immediately secure the total support of the existing central government, which may be a lot to expect. It can be introduced prudently and stealthily in a piecemeal, experimental but active way in areas and sectors like health and social care particularly favourable to it, where, for example, local people are already voluntarily acting socially and cooperatively, before being generalised upwards and outwards over time as the economic and social advantages of letting the people decide, which is what this thesis is ultimately all about, letting the people decide, become financially obvious, as we clearly think they will. Already thriving areas of public enterprise, sociability and cooperativeness gradually enlarging. And even if our own central government takes a negative attitude to any progressive public service proposals, including this one, which is certainly not unlikely, we only need some more receptive government somewhere, even possibly a devolved administration within the UK, since all governments have paying for care problems, to prove it can work and hopefully start the more general ball rolling. If, and only if, these reforms are implemented here, however, will our essential care needs ever be fully met, good fulfilling professional public jobs created, some at least of our existing maldistribution of incomes reduced at root, the environment improved, positive climate change facilitated, inflationary pressures mitigated, the international payments imbalance lessened, and at least in its social and cooperative respects a new much needed model for private enterprise established, a point we shall be emphasising in our next following YouTube submission, which I sincerely hope you will also check into. Otherwise, our chronic misreading of the public-private world continues as it is now. These crucial developments are strangled at birth, and we, especially the poorest and neediest of us, continue to bear the increasingly great social, economic and environmental costs of our then continuing basic economic confusions. Short of any other answer which could possibly meet the bill, we here can imagine no obvious feasible alternative to what we here propose. So let's at least some of us somewhere, some of our sympathetic public organisations and pressure groups perhaps, start to get behind this, put some pressures on and try and get this all absolutely necessary though far from guaranteed, yet quite simple thing moving, wherever we can, locally or nationally now, while there is still time. For this is not some minor technical matter. It is crucial to our whole future health and welfare, for the very, very many already a real matter of life and death. And it's about time we all recognise this, that here, there's so very, very much at stake. Thank you.